All right, today we are going to wrap up Unit 8, with the covering of the Jane Austen tutorial, which goes over the novel Pride and Prejudice. What I am going to do is I'm going to let a series of, 15 videos play through. I am going to also include the playlist link with the video for class, and then I have one other thing that it goes along with one of the tutorial questions. So I'm going to play through all of these videos, and then we're going to take a look at the lesson activity questions. So we'll read through the questions and then we'll actually discuss them after the videos. That's how we'll do it. Okay, so discuss the role of women in society as portrayed in Pride and Prejudice. What statement does Jane Austen seem to make about women of her era and their options in life? And support with evidence from the text, and when we talk about it, I'll give you an example. Part B, what theme other than class, marriage, pride, and prejudice, so those are 4 themes. I have videos that talk about other themes that come up. I think it brings up some other ones. What role does sarcasm play? I will just talk about that. I don't think that gets covered with any of these videos. And then Part D, you're going to do your own. Done this before with other works. Go in, look for words. And then Part E, what do you notice about her diction or word choice? So I actually will just link a presentation that kind of explains this, like a lot about what all of this is, and gives you lots of examples. So that's something that you can look at on your own to form your own response. So without further ado, let's get to these videos. Whoops. All right, gotta start.
In the introduction, the Bennets learn of a wealthy new neighbor, Mr. Bingley. Mrs. Bennet hatches a plan to have one of her daughters marry him. She and her 5 daughters set the plan in motion. In the rising action, the Bennets attend a ball. Bingley, who also attends, dances with Jane Bennet. Bingley's friend, Mr. Darcy, behaves snobbishly toward Elizabeth Bennet. Mr. Collins, a cousin of Mr. Bennet and potential heir, visits Longbourn, the Bennet family home, in order to find a wife. Mr. Collins proposes to Elizabeth, but she refuses him. Mr. Collins then proposes to Charlotte Lucas, a friend of the Bennets, and they marry. The Bingleys and Mr. Darcy depart for London. Jane is upset, as she was expecting a proposal from Bingley and didn't receive it. She doesn't know why. Elizabeth then goes on holiday with the Gardiners. In the climax, Mr. Darcy proposes to Elizabeth, but she refuses him for his rude and inappropriate delivery of the proposal. And in the falling action, a letter from Darcy makes Elizabeth rethink her prejudices toward him. Lydia, the youngest Bennet girl, runs off with Wickham, causing a scandal and putting the reputation of the Bennets in jeopardy. Darcy secretly pays him to marry her. And in the resolution, Bingley and Jane, after some tribulations, are married, and Mr. Darcy proposes to Elizabeth again, correctly this time, by telling her that he's in love with her. She accepts, and they are happily married. Jane Austen wrote Pride and Prejudice in England's Georgian era. She revised the novel during the Regency era, which began in 1811. During the Regency era, the English were worried that Napoleon Bonaparte might try to cross the English Channel. As a result, militias formed around the country. The temporary posting of the militia in Meryton, the town where much of Pride and Prejudice takes place, reflects this concern about invasion. The Regency era also marked the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. The ensuing trade and manufacturing opportunities allowed some individuals to accumulate massive wealth. This brought sweeping changes to England's economy and society. The plot of Pride and Prejudice follows women of the gentry in search of a husband. In order to understand Austen's interpretation of the time period, it's important to understand the different social contexts the novel plays on. In Austen's England, the social hierarchy can be likened to a 5-level pyramid. Royalty, kings, queens, princes; aristocracy or nobility, dukes, earls, barons; upper-class gentry, including landed gentry with large estates; high-level clergy and government officials; middle gentry, including people with smaller estates, military officers, and lower-level clergy, and the lower and working classes. For the most part, Pride and Prejudice represents the interactions of characters from the middle of the pyramid, the gentry. Even though the members of this class often lacked the wealth and resources of the aristocracy, they were free to socialize with them. Women of the gentry did not have careers. In the upper classes, a woman's only acceptable role in society was as a wife. To prepare for her role as a wife, a woman had to master the rules of etiquette. Women who did not marry did not have a clear role in society. Called spinsters, they might at best manage the household of an unmarried brother. Austen herself never married. When her father died, she lived off money provided by her brothers. Unlike other writers of her period, Austen gave her novels everyday settings and characters who lead relatively normal lives. Her protagonists struggle with real problems, usually involving courtship and marriage, through trial and error. Her genius lay in holding the mirror up to the follies and vices of early 19th century English society through lively dialogue and sharply drawn characters. Chapter 1 of Pride and Prejudice opens with one of the most quoted lines in English literature. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. The chapter then introduces the Bennet family of Longbourn, which includes Mr. and Mrs. Bennet and their 5 daughters, Jane, Elizabeth, Mary, Kitty, and Lydia. Mrs. Bennet announces that the wealthy Charles Bingley has moved into the neighborhood to the grand estate of Netherfield Park. Because Mr. Bingley is unmarried, Mrs. Bennet asks her husband to call on Mr. Bingley so that their daughters can be properly introduced to the eligible bachelor. With her opening line, Austen identifies the impetus for many of the events to come. Through the dialogue that follows, readers are introduced to Mr. and Mrs. Bennet. While Mrs. Bennet is driven to get her daughters married, Mr. Bennet is a more nuanced character. Austen emphasizes that it is his humor, reserve, and caprice that have served him in his dealing with his less intelligent wife. Even after 23 years of marriage, Mrs. Bennet is still oblivious to her husband's sarcasm. In Chapter 2 of Pride and Prejudice, Mr. Bennet teases the family before ultimately revealing he already called on Mr. Bingley. The news sends Mrs. Bennet and the daughters into a frenzy. The women engage in light banter on who will be Bingley's favorite, and Mrs. Bennet begins excitedly plotting Mr. Bingley's future visits to Longbourn. The conversation between Mr. and Mrs. Bennet confirms he enjoys being an irritant, pretending he hasn't visited Mr. Bingley when he has. This chapter reflects the importance Mrs. Bennet places on following the rules of etiquette. Now that Mr. Bennet has met Mr. Bingley, the daughters are one step closer to an introduction, a key step in Mrs. Bennet's plan to marry one of her daughters to him. In Chapter 3 of Pride and Prejudice, Mr. Bingley visits Mr. Bennet, and the sisters are able to glimpse him from a window, but do not actually get to meet him. Mr. Bennet invites Bingley for dinner, but he has to decline as he's going out of town. A neighbor of the Bennets, Mrs. Lucas, reports that Bingley is on his way to London, but will be present at a ball that will soon take place in the neighborhood. Mr. Bingley attends the Meryton ball with his unmarried sister, Caroline Bingley, as well as his married sister and her husband, Mr. and Mrs. Hurst. A friend of his, Mr. Darcy, attends with him. During the ball, Bingley makes a good impression on the Bennets. He seeks out Jane and dances with her twice. In contrast, Bingley's friend, Mr. Darcy, seems aloof and disagreeable. When Bingley encourages Mr. Darcy to dance with Elizabeth, she overhears Darcy describe her as tolerable, but not handsome enough to tempt me. When they get home, Mr. and Mrs. Bennet discuss Darcy's rudeness and solidify their negative impression of him. Elizabeth and Darcy have their first encounter, and their first impressions establish one of the main threads of the plot. Darcy's attitude and aloofness leaves Elizabeth with a very unfavorable impression of him. In contrast, Charles Bingley and Jane Bennet's first encounter is much more pleasant. As the plot unfolds, they'll have misunderstandings paralleling Elizabeth and Darcy. In Chapter 4 of Pride and Prejudice, Jane and Elizabeth discuss the ball, especially the attention Mr. Bingley pays to Jane. Elizabeth points out how she and her sister are different in temperament. We learn that Jane is more accepting, which blinds her to people's faults. Elizabeth, on the other hand, is less accepting and doesn't hesitate to express her opinions. Simultaneously, Mr. Bingley, his sisters, and Mr. Darcy discuss the ball. Mr. Bingley found the women who attended lovely and charming, especially Jane Bennet. Mr. Darcy found little beauty or fashion among the attendees. They all agree that Jane is very pretty and perhaps worth knowing. The aftermath of the Meryton Ball provides character insights. Elizabeth considers herself less kind and generous than her sister. She teasingly accuses Jane of being oblivious to others' flaws. Ironically, criticism of obliviousness will later apply to Elizabeth as impressions evolve. Elizabeth's reflections on the Bingley sisters illustrate attitudes on class. The Bingleys being newly rich makes them less respected by landed gentry. Austen emphasizes that this makes their snobbery more pronounced and irritating. In Chapter 5 of Pride and Prejudice, during a social call, the Lucas family and Bennets discuss the ball. In particular, Mr. Darcy's rude behavior. Charlotte Lucas, a good friend of Elizabeth's, sympathizes with her annoyance. She points out that Darcy's pride may be explained by his status. Elizabeth acknowledges this as a possibility, but admits she was hurt by Darcy's treatment. Throughout the novel, Charlotte Lucas will represent a realist's point of view on women, men, and class. Later, we'll see her capitulating to a marriage of security that reflects her acceptance of the social structure. Her own father, Sir William Lucas, has been knighted, a great honor and, until the Industrial Revolution, one of the only ways for a commoner to move up in the world. Austen paints Sir William Lucas as vain about his knighthood, though her ridicule is mild. In Chapter 6 of Pride and Prejudice, Elizabeth and Jane and the Bingley sisters exchange customary visits. Although the Bingley sisters seem to approve of Jane, they find Mrs. Bennet intolerable and the younger sisters dull. Jane is flattered by their approval, but Elizabeth considers the sisters to be snooty. At a party at Lucas Lodge, Sir William Lucas's estate, Elizabeth and Charlotte discuss Jane's fondness for Mr. Bingley. While Elizabeth is pleased by Jane's modesty and discretion, Charlotte suggests that Jane should make her feelings toward Bingley more obvious. If not, he won't know his feelings are reciprocated, and Jane will lose her chance. Likewise, Mr. Darcy begins to show admiration for Elizabeth. Although she does make an effort to speak with him at the party, she later refuses his offer to dance, dismissing him as all politeness. Darcy admits to Caroline Bingley that he finds Elizabeth attractive. Caroline teases him about what that marriage would entail, Mrs. Bennet as his mother-in-law. Charlotte and Elizabeth's conversation highlights the fine line women of the day had to walk. They must be discreet in courtship while also communicating their attraction. Charlotte is the voice of practicality and is worried Jane will lose her chance if she's not more forthcoming in showing her affections. This foreshadows a future conflict for Jane. Elizabeth's refusal to dance with Darcy shows her self-control and her wit. Caroline persists in denigrating the Bennets, probably because she's interested in the eligible Darcy. This will influence events to come. Chapter 7 of Pride and Prejudice opens with details about Bennet family finances, including the entail of the estate to a male Bennet heir, preventing any of the Bennet's daughters from inheriting it. News comes from the nearby town of Meryton of the arrival of the militia, which excites the younger Bennet sisters. Jane is invited to visit the Bingleys' home in Netherfield. Mrs. Bennet sends Jane on horseback rather than in a carriage. Her ulterior motive is to ensure that if the weather turned bad, Jane will have to stay longer. Then the Bennets receive a letter saying that Jane is ill. Elizabeth becomes worried and goes to Netherfield to check on her. The 3-mile trek results in her arriving with muddy skirts. The Bingley sisters, although polite, disapprove of her appearance. However, Darcy is struck by her bright complexion, the result of her vigorous walk. Elizabeth finds Jane to be quite ill and decides to stay to take care of her. Details about Mrs. Bennet's family paint a fuller picture of the Bennet status in society. Mr. Bennet is a member of the landed gentry, though not a very wealthy one. Mrs. Bennet's family, in comparison, is respectable, but not landed gentry. This fuels Caroline Bingley's disapproval of her. Ironically, the Bingleys themselves are not landed gentry either. The arrival of the militia reflects the novel's setting when England feared French invasion. These concerns are far from the minds of the young Bennet daughters, whose only concern is the supply of young men in town. This chapter reveals the lengths to which Mrs. Bennet will go to ensure her daughter's marriage. Chapter 8 of Pride and Prejudice is set during a dinner at Netherfield. The conversations are strained, and Elizabeth feels uncomfortable. To Caroline's irritation, Bingley and Darcy express their admiration for Elizabeth. The Bingley sisters behave politely toward Elizabeth when in her presence, but she senses their true feelings about her. As the Bingley sisters make snide remarks behind her back, Mr. Darcy begins to appreciate Elizabeth's wit and ability to express her ideas clearly. In discussing what makes a woman accomplished, Darcy is struck by her intelligence. Where Caroline Bingley is too ready to agree with anything he says, Elizabeth is opinionated and willing to engage intellectually. Darcy's admiration reveals that he prefers a woman who is assertive, which directly contradicts Elizabeth's initial impression of him. He's also pleased that she's unimpressed by his wealth. In Chapter 9 of Pride and Prejudice, Jane's health does not improve, so Mrs. Bennet decides to check on her with the younger daughters. During their visit, Elizabeth is embarrassed by her family's behavior. Mrs. Bennet chatters incessantly, and Lydia boldly asks Bingley when he intends to host a ball. Mr. Bingley is polite about this query and answers that once Jane is well, he will. Here, the interaction between Bingleys and Bennets provides insight into the families. Concepts such as class, social standing, and etiquette continue to develop. Elizabeth converses with Darcy as an intellectual equal, but Mrs. Bennet overdoes it with strong opinions as well as her efforts to promote Jane over Charlotte. Even though Elizabeth is embarrassed by her family's behavior, Caroline Bingley does herself no favors in revealing her snobbishness. These developments allow Darcy to see Elizabeth more clearly. Caroline's harping on her own status and disdain for others puts Elizabeth's intelligence and grace into focus. In Chapter 10 of Pride and Prejudice, Elizabeth remains at Netherfield while Jane recuperates. She observes Caroline Bingley flirting with Mr. Darcy, and that he appears uninterested in her. In fact, he seems increasingly intrigued by Elizabeth's personality and ideas. Darcy admits to himself his growing interest in her, but is aware that his interest is limited because of her family's lower social status. Caroline's aggressive pursuit of Darcy becomes almost comic in its desperation. Her scheming and snobbishness only casts Elizabeth as a refreshing presence for Darcy. Darcy's appreciation for Elizabeth makes him a more likable character. He's not fooled by Caroline Bingley's self-serving comments. Instead, he admires Elizabeth's original personality and independent spirit. In Chapter 11 of Pride and Prejudice, Jane's health begins to improve, and she's able to join the others downstairs. Bingley seeks out her attention. Caroline asks Elizabeth to walk up and down the room with her to get Mr. Darcy's attention. This strategy backfires when it turns into Elizabeth and Darcy engaging in an energetic discussion and ends with the pair exchanging flirtatious insults. Elizabeth says to Darcy, "Your defect is to hate everybody," and he responds by pointing out hers is to willfully misunderstand them. Darcy becomes more intrigued with Elizabeth. While he seems conscious of this attraction, Elizabeth seems not to be. A telling line of dialogue occurs when Darcy says, "My good opinion once lost is lost forever," a self-assessment that will be put to the test in future chapters. Elizabeth speaks bluntly to Darcy, but Darcy appears not to take offense. He's flirtatious, while Elizabeth is openly disdainful. In Chapter 12 of Pride and Prejudice, Jane and Elizabeth are ready to return to Longbourn. However, Mrs. Bennet is not exactly thrilled Jane's stay is coming to an end. She tells them there's no carriage available for their return. The Bennet sisters are forced to take the Bingley carriage home. On the day of their departure, Darcy treats Elizabeth coldly in order to discourage any warm feelings she may have for him. When Jane and Elizabeth reach home, Mrs. Bennet is not happy to have them back. Mr. Bennet, however, is relieved to have them return for the sake of interesting conversation, since all the younger sisters chatter about are the regiment officers encamped nearby. After 5 days of staying at Netherfield, the Bennet sisters are ready to leave. Bingley's sisters are ready to have these sisters, their superiors in manners and inferiors in wealth, gone. Caroline is happy to see Elizabeth parted from Mr. Darcy. Only Mr. Bingley and Mrs. Bennet are disappointed because Jane is leaving Netherfield. For his part, Darcy is becoming concerned about his growing attraction to Elizabeth. He assumes she must be interested in him for his wealth. His resolve to discourage her affections shows how badly he has misread her.
All right, so let's go back up here. I will show the theme one after we talk about parts A and C, and yeah, so parts A and C. Okay, so discuss the role of women in society as portrayed in Pride and Prejudice. What statement does she seem to make about women of her era and their options in life? Support your response with evidence from the text. Okay, so the chapter 1 analysis and summary brought this up right away. And so it's this opening line and then kind of the one right after it. But so it is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. So let's break that down. It is a truth universally acknowledged. So everybody knows this. This is absolutely a fact. It is a truth. Anywhere you go in the entire world, in the entire universe, people are going to agree with this. All right. So that a single man in possession of a good fortune. So an unmarried rich man, okay, like single man, unmarried, good fortune, rich. So it is a truth. It's a universal truth that single rich men must be in want of a wife. Single rich men are looking for a woman. That's what this is saying. So right off the bat, we're hearing that like men want wives. Okay. And then, however little known the feelings or views of such a man may be on his first entering a neighborhood, this truth is so well fixed in the minds of the surrounding families that he is considered the rightful property of someone or other of their daughters. So again, here it is just saying like whether or not he knows this, like the women, the unmarried daughters around, like they're going to be thrown at him if there's a single man a coming. And so that's how we're introduced to this story. So basically, and then basically we get right in this that the purpose for women is to marry. And so this is an example of that. Women, as you would have read earlier on in the Jane Austen's time, and you got a little bit in the context video, women really didn't have a role in society if they weren't married. Their purpose was to be married, to have families, all of that. Otherwise, they had to live off of somebody else's money once their parents died. They couldn't have jobs if they were in this higher class. So that's really what we're looking at. The role of women in society as portrayed in Pride and Prejudice is to be a wife. That is the role. And that's really the only option other than like what you learned in the videos Jane Austen did, which was live off the money of her brother. But this right here, right off the top of the play, and I mean, really anywhere you look, you're going to see examples of just that, like looking for a husband. Okay, skip over B just for now. Okay, what role does sarcasm play in Pride and Prejudice? How does its role differ from that of irony? How do both sarcasm and irony affect your understanding of the story? Okay, so sarcasm is a form of irony. We would call it verbal irony. But again, if we go back to this very opening line, this very first line is an example of sarcasm. The reason that this is an example of sarcasm is because, is that a universal truth? Like, does everybody know that a single rich man is looking for a wife? I mean, she's making a point that that's like kind of ridiculous, saying that it is a universal truth, but then showing this example of this mother who is obsessed with finding suitable matches for her 5 daughters. And then one of the things that you get in that, as far as irony goes, oh, sorry, I forgot. What role does it play? So sarcasm brings humor into the story. That is almost always the role of sarcasm in anything, other than sometimes to like be particularly insulting. And then when it comes to irony, the best example would really be between Darcy and Elizabeth, because they both like each other, but like Darcy was really rude at first, and the way that Elizabeth reacted to that is what made him attracted to her, but like she's not attracted to him because he's rude, but then when he starts being nice, she is, and then he's rude to her again. And so that's ironic because it's just them going back and forth and like not really being truthful about who they are and what their feelings are. And so it's ironic that like they both like each other, but they go through these like misunderstandings and prejudices. And then you have to answer this. I can't tell you how it affects your understanding, but how do both sarcasm and irony affect your understanding of the story? And okay, like I said, okay, cool. Now I will just show the theme video. I think I already talked about it in like the introduction one a little bit, but you're just thinking beyond the theme of class, marriage, pride, and prejudice for this one.
Let's review the themes of Pride and Prejudice, starting with social class. Pride and Prejudice centers around the role of social class and status in romantic life. People know their place in society. Noble and wealthy families were uninclined to marry below themselves. Since, in the upper classes, the primary reasons for marriage were status, wealth, and land, love is pitted against marriage. Therefore, social circles are distinguished by old and new money, inclusion in the gentry, and aristocratic status. In the end, Darcy and Elizabeth must overcome social class by disobeying the wish of Lady Catherine that Darcy not marry below him. The importance of reputation, especially a woman's reputation, is woven through the novel. For instance, Elizabeth's walk through the rain to see her sister is not understood as caring and noble, but rather unladylike. Another example is Lydia and Wickham's scandalous elopement, which potentially would have prevented the other Bennet sisters from finding suitable husbands. Mr. Collins writes to recommend that they disown Lydia and consider her dead. This illustrates how Lydia's actions might prevent Elizabeth's ability to marry someone like Darcy. Love versus marriage. At the center of Pride and Prejudice is the love story between Elizabeth and Darcy. However, Austen makes it clear this is not love at first sight. Instead, it shows the complexity of marital arrangement in a time when status and wealth played a more significant role. Many of the couples in the novel marry for practical purposes: Charlotte and Mr. Collins, the Bennets, and even Lydia and Wickham. At the end of the novel, only 3 couples marry for love: Elizabeth and Darcy, Jane and Bingley, and the Gardiners. Austen uses these 3 couples to illustrate what honest relationships look like. In the case of Elizabeth and Darcy, their first impressions or prejudices were negative. These prejudices act to build tension throughout the novel, ultimately leading to a happy ending. In this way, Austen emphasizes that the road to love is often littered with misunderstandings and complications, and does not occur on sight.
All right. So, let's see. The reputation is the one that talks about that isn't included in there. So it gives you a couple of examples, you know, and yeah. Let's see. And then you have the discussion of themes and stuff as you go through the slides on the Pride and Prejudice part. So if we click along, obviously all of this is super important, but you start getting marriage, class consciousness. So we talked about class, the prejudice, and then pride is like kind of wrapped up in that whole thing. So you can use what you have here to connect the 2 of them together. Okay, so that covers A, B, and C. You have to do D on your own, and then I am going to include a link for you to cover part E. And so that basically covers everything for the Jane Austen tutorial. And then I will also be posting a quiz review or a test review, test prep sheet like I've been doing for the other tests for this one. And that's all. All right, hope this helps. Good luck.